Hello, hello. I am so excited to bring you this moral leadership room today. We have Rohini. Hi, Rohini. It's you. Welcome. Welcome to Clubhouse.
Hello.
Hello. It is so nice to meet you. And
Hi, Kat.
Melissa. Hi. I know we're waiting for Jacqueline and a few others to join. Melissa, I see the lock in this room. It looks like when the room was created, it was created for members only. So now I'm trying to figure out how to, let visitors in. Unlock, yes. Okay, now it will be visible to everyone. Perfect. All right. Hello, everyone. There's Jacqueline, her moderator. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone. Hi, Jacqueline.
Hi, it's so good to be here, Rohini. How are you?
Hi, my dear friend Jacqueline. How are you?
I'm great. Kat, so great to see you too, or hear you.
Yes, indeed. I'm bringing up, let's see, we have Suhani. Melissa, is that everyone that we have here that needs to come up?
We've got Mahesh too. He's new to Clubhouse.
Let's see, invite to speak. There we go, Mahesh. I love seeing all of these party hats. Welcome to Clubhouse. For those who are joining and filling the room, welcome to a special room, Moral Imagination in Crisis. And Jacqueline Novogratz hosts the Moral Leadership Club and also is founder and runs Acumen Fund and has led impact initiatives all over the world. And in this club and in this room, she brings amazing moral leaders together, people who are on their own journey to have a positive impact. And Jacqueline speaks so beautifully and eloquently, and her work evidences her advocacy for a more moral way to lead needed in this new economy. And it is my pleasure to host and moderate. And if you've got questions or comments, please use the back channel feature. Message me, the little airplane at the bottom right. So you click the airplane, send me any questions or comments, and we will work those questions into the discussion. And with that, I will pass it over to Jacqueline to introduce our guests, this club, and this room.
Well, thank you so much, Kat. And as I said, thank you for everyone to come. This is it is a new room. This is only our third in the series on moral leaders, new leaders for a new economy. And as you said, we're going to focus on the moral imagination in crisis. And I love working with you, Kat. And you're such a Sherpa of all these ideas and people. And I'm so excited to be inviting and including Rohini NileKani, who I have known for decades now. And I have watched her and been inspired by her as an author, an activist philanthropy, a rabble-rouser of the best kind. So welcome, Rohini. And as with all of these rooms that we're doing with moral leadership, I always want to start with a poem or a quote that is connected to the idea of the imagination, and thought that today I would start with one by Albert Einstein, a man who lived for understanding and with great imagination. Of imagination, he said that imagination is more important than knowledge, for knowledge is limited, whereas imagination embraces the entire world, stimulating progress, giving birth to evolution. And so it's only fair to start, before I bring Rohini in, to ask what the moral imagination is. At Acumen, the organization that I run, we say that it's the humility to see the world as it is and the audacity to imagine what it could be. It's a practice that's based in empathy, but it doesn't end with empathy, because empathy alone reinforces the status quo. It's easier to feel another person's pain and not do anything about it, if you will. Moral imagination demands moving to understanding, immersing, and then acting. I've been thinking about this conversation and how this past year and a half has been a time where it was impossible to escape feeling another's pain. We all experienced the pandemic collectively, and nothing else. This should have been a time that reminded us that we're in this together, and that our actions and inaction, including how we build our very systems, impact people in our neighborhoods and across the globe. But some of us were hit in horrendous, disastrous ways in a pandemic that was literally like a heat-seeking missile aimed squarely at the poor and vulnerable. Not only in communities in which we live, but in entire nations. And India, as many of you remember, was just hit twice. One at the beginning of lockdown, where you saw 100 million migrant workers suddenly far away from their homes with no money and no transport, no shelter. And then in 2021, where we saw that wave really in an extraordinary way hit countless Indians, sending probably 250 million back into poverty. So today we want to talk about the short-term crisis and what do we do, and also how we think about it in the long term, and what are some of the trends that may be coming out of this moment that if we used our own moral imagination, we could put into the future. So with that, Rohini, you've worked in some of the poorest communities in India, and yet you are one of the world's most prominent philanthropists. And so you walk in a way that I've always admired. You immerse yourself truly in problems. I've watched you sit in villages on the floor with women. I've taken a 13-hour overnight train with you, I think in second class. And there's a way that you interact with people that is about true connection and true listening, which is so connected to moral imagination. And I just want to start by asking how someone of such privilege, where do you learn to connect? Where do you learn to put yourself in another person's shoes? Not you as in the universal you, but you, Rohini NileKani.
Thank you, Jacqueline, for those kind words. And namaste, everyone. And thank you, Kat. Nice to get to know you here. You ask, where does one learn to do that? I think a lot of us learn these kind of values from our families, right? And the same went for me. In my family, we were always asked to look outside of ourselves, even in order to sustain ourselves. And we were always told the stories of my grandfather and both my grandfathers and others who were very active in their communities as philanthropists, as volunteers, and so on. So that culture of looking beyond the self was what I was gifted and grew up with. And with, I think, with all the privileges that came to us as we found ourselves becoming wealthy, I think it only reinforced my sense of trusteeship of wealth, which I learned from my family. And I was always curious about things, and I think that helps me to hopefully stay connected, Jacqueline. And I've seen you do that too. And honestly, it's quite easy. The minute you don't think of yourself as someone special, because who's special anyway? And you can just really look at the other person. That's it. You can make an instant connection to anyone across the globe.
I love that. I think a lot, Rohini, about what it means to see another person neither above nor below you. And you think of people like Mandela, who did that so extraordinarily. And it seems like something we should all do. And yet our systems are created so that somehow we don't. And so I want to push you a little bit in terms of curiosity, but also everything in the world, particularly as you became wealthy and visible and prominent, would keep you away from people, would keep you, my brother Michael said that when he became very wealthy, he realized that suddenly people were treating him as if his IQ had gone up 10%. And then he had to actually start to find people that kept him more humble. And I just wonder if there are other things that have enabled you to keep this way of being that I've just watched.
I think it's very true that with wealth comes a kind of power that you have to learn to become aware of. And I was knocked back quite a few times when I was not aware of it, because then it felt really like arrogance to others because I was not acknowledging the power that goes with wealth. But once I had understood that, I realized that there are many ways to be with that power. You don't have to show power in one particular way or live within power only with one particular way, right? So, in fact, once I had got over all the astonishment of being wealthy, I began to see the opportunity actually of using that wealth to delve into some notions that I had been developing over the years about what I call the Samaj Bazaar Sarkar continuum, which is Samaj is society, Bazaar is markets, and Sarkar is the state, and how Samaj, that is all of us, the wealthy and not so wealthy, the politicians and the business people, the saints and the sadhus and everybody on the street, we are all citizens, we are all part of society, and how it is really time for society to take back to what belongs to it, which was perhaps ceded too much to markets and state. And once I began to live in that idea and that framework, then Samaj was everybody, right? And I was very interested in finding out more about how Samaj and society operates. And Samaj is people, and I found that I could use the privileges to connect more and more and more and more deeply.
I really just love you. Can I just put that out there? And you wrote in the foreword actually to my first book. You talked about that. So you've been talking about the market and society, the civil society and government for a long, long time. So let me just bring you right now into this pandemic, Rohini, because certainly in the United States, and I would dare say in India as well, what we saw was two things. On the one hand, how unequal our societies truly are, and how isolated and abandoned so many people felt. And yet, we saw people reaching out to other people. When you first were experiencing this pandemic, and you were thinking about yourself within it, particularly in terms of moral imagination, how did you not just feel overwhelmed, and how did you move quickly into action?
I don't know, Jacqueline, that's a good question, because I might have succumbed to a kind of a despair and isolation, but I found myself kind of charged up with the things that needed to be done. And what I think enthused me the most was to watch a lot of the organizations that we have been partnering with over the years very quickly get onto the front line. And they reached out to us, and it was so easy. We didn't have to do much because they were doing so much. We just had to trust them and enable them with what we could, which is financial resources, and then to get all the stories coming back from the ground of how quickly they were moving, how, what occurred to me that with social media and so many other kinds of things that keep us digital, even our neighbors had become strangers, right? We may know somebody at the other end of the world, but we don't know who lives next to us sometimes. The pandemic changed that. Strangers became neighbors. And our neighbors who had become strangers became very much like the cords that connect us all to each other. And we had to rediscover. It took that kind of separation where we had to be in masks and behind fences to reconnect us to our neighbors, to our family, and to our friends. And to see how ordinary people went out there and started to help people they did not even know. So one was to make the strangers back into neighbors, and the other was to reach out to real strangers and show that we could be kind to strangers again. I picked up from that, I think, to keep sanity and to keep working.
Could you give a story, Rohini, and then I'm going to actually share a story?
So just a very quick story about a young friend of mine who comes from a privileged background. She just decided this won't do, and she just got off from her house and she started collecting food, and she rented a truck and she went all over, especially the most underprivileged slums of Bangalore, where especially of the minority communities, and she just went there, parked her truck, and started distributing food and other stuff to people. There were a lot. She encountered trouble after trouble. She persisted. She collected money from a lot of friends and family, and she just persisted and persisted. And I cannot tell you how many such people were there across the length and breadth of India, feeding the migrants, feeding the sick, carrying parcels, just showing what it means to be human.
Yeah, I love that. We you talked about becoming neighbors, and I think about becoming community as well. That as you know, we've got about 1,000 fellows around the world now, and fellows are younger people that are focused on solving problems of poverty, many at the grassroots level, and in fact, I'm going to bring Sahani Mohan in a little bit later. But when and Acumen has access to very wealthy donors who support us. And when the pandemic hit and lockdown was happening across the world, we were seeing a level of suffering that we'd not seen in any of our communities. And while the United States had government, going back to year 3, that was looking at the PPPs and ways of getting people cash, that was not the case in most of the rest of the world, certainly not the developing world. And so we reached out to our community of donors, and we said, we need to raise money, we need to raise it really fast, and we're going to turn around and we're going to change our organization and get small grants to individuals with very few questions asked, except for understanding what they were going to do with it, knowing obviously that they had the right kinds of organizations. And the kind of response on both sides brought me closer to the work than I often am, even when I'm traveling and able to go into the villages. And so I see what you saw, both on a micro and on a macro level, and I keep thinking to myself, how do we take this kind of approach, more trust-based, more community-based, bringing what you have to each other to rebuild a new economy?
Yeah, I think trust came back as a resource last year. Okay, the big philanthropists, the small guys, everybody realized that you have to lead with trust. If you want to end with trust, you have to begin with trust. And I think that got established a lot in the field of altruism last year. So there's a lot more interest in what is now being called trust-based philanthropy, which at the heart of it says what? Lead with trust. Then, if your trust is betrayed, you can always isolate that incident, analyze it, and restore some balance. But if you lead with trust, you are going to end up with trust. That has been my experience in 3 decades.
Jacqueline, I'd love to jump in here and just pile onto the questions for you, and then Rohini as well. But this doubling down on this idea of trust, and trust coming from people feeling seen and connected, and that largely coming from this feeling of being neighbors and community. How do you feel the definition of that has changed through the pandemic, and what are you seeing last? That maybe our memories won't be short, and we will think of community in a more powerful way. I would love to hear your thoughts on just what is community now, and for those who may not feel they have it, how to either extend that olive branch, as Rohini was saying, lead with trust, which makes me think of the Disney movie where Raya in The Last Dragon, where she had, even though she's been hurt, she still has to give in order to give someone the feeling of being trusted, so they do the right thing. I have toddlers, so it just comes to mind. I would just love your thoughts on community and really centering around this idea, so people who are listening from all over the world are reminded of what we actually have the power to create.
I love that. And it's interesting because, Clubhouse is a social media platform, and it is one that allows people to go deeper and to hear each other, which is so different, even in terms of building trust, than too many of our social media platforms where we're seeing trust eroding. And so, like so many of these conversations, and certainly when we talk about how we build that new economy, there's almost a polarity where we're watching some people just, hammer each other based on a word used incorrectly or a feeling that, mask, no mask. And so I've seen the erosion. And at the same time, as you said, I do think that we are seeing different definitions of community that are locally based and yet also globally connected with more awareness. And that's also been facilitated by social media. And so how do we double down on the latter? Mahesh Yagnaraman is also on this call. We want to bring him up. But when that second wave of I'll start global, Kat, and then I'm going to go local. But when that second wave that was so extraordinary, devastating in India happened, we had a little bit of money left from our first emergency fund. But Mahesh said, I don't think we need money right now for the actual organizations because our 150 fellows in India are suffering so badly. We need to get them money to survive. Something like 70% had a family member in hospital, and this is a time when there was no oxygen, there was no ventilators, there were no beds, and so people who'd been killing themselves for a year now in real crisis. And can I create a facility where we just give grants to people for these acute personal needs that they have? And we said, yes, it's obviously got to be documented, etc. And not only does trust beget trust, but it also releases generosity. And so the fellows, these individuals, some of whom make $200 a month for working nonstop for these poor communities, said that they didn't want a grant. They wanted the opportunity to pay it back if they could. Obviously, some couldn't. But if they could, so that other people could pay it forward. And then a young woman in Spain said, well, I'm part of this community, and I have access to social media, and she knew how to work with blockchain. And so she created an accountability system where she could reach out to her communities and raised almost $50,000 for the India community, where the Indian fellows chose who would get the money. And then another wealthy philanthropist from the United States called me and said, I really want to help. What can I do? And we had a list of great organizations in India that could take larger sums of his money. And he said, but what are you doing? And I said, well, we have this acute thing that we're working on right now, but I don't know if that would be of interest to you because some people want to be private, et cetera, et cetera. It's not the way philanthropy is typically used, not institutionally. And he said, this is a community I trust. And you're telling me that that is the greatest need. And so I know that their needs are only going to grow. So you take this. You give me back the reports of what you can report on. You assure me that there's accountability, and no more questions asked. That, Kat, in philanthropy that has been so power dominated, where who has the money makes all the decisions, and where there's been in my own history often a lot of dishonesty, mistrust across these sides. That was the melting of lines. And then I have many stories even in my own community, but I've been going on too long and I want to make sure that we bring in Rohini. But I'd also love to ask you, Kat, because you are more corporate and US based, what you have seen.
I think it's very similar, this through line of expanding, and I'll use my words. I won't suggest that these are the words of all corporate leaders or as much of a shift in mindset as I would want it to be, but I have felt in my circles more accountability and sense of responsibility for the communities in which we work and play, from when our employees come, and this idea of the sensibility and accountability, the care that extends far beyond the commercial walls and relationships. I do feel there has been a lasting shift in many corporate circles and many corporations. I mean, pre-COVID, at least on the North America side, there was certainly and still is a growing movement around care for planet, care for people. Even consumers are voting with their wallet for more conscious companies, for products that are better for bodies and better for planet, for companies that pay their workers better. All of this, what used to be behind the corporate veil, is now of concern to customers, and I believe that will only be more true over time. But that isn't enough to create the shifts toward moral leadership. And so this crisis that has affected us all, where no one, no matter how rich or poor, could escape the effects of the pandemic, and then disproportionately they existed in poorer or under-resourced communities, and the numbers of communities of color in the U.S. in particular are staggering at how much more detrimental the pandemic or the related pandemic dynamics, in particular economic, have continued to be in these communities. And so the death of the middle, the rich richer, the poor poorer, this divide still grows. And at the same time, I do see more corporate concern and an expanded view of community from companies that might not be obvious. So of course, if they were companies like a Chobani that started with that you've had in your club and in this on this show and this series, that have a stated mission and their actions line up with their words of truly treating their employees and their customers as community with real care through their actions. Not all companies, were started with such a mission or are run with such leadership. And so even those less expected companies, I have seen an expansion of a definition of community, more care for their employees and their personal lives. To your point of what do we do with our dollars left in our fund? Can we go outside of our typical process, outside of our typical approvals, in order to change for what we're funding and what the money goes to, because it's just the right thing for those we serve? And you're seeing more people do what I like to see, which is break their own rules. They're breaking their own rules because they're realizing their rules from the past don't serve the community of today, and that their definition of community is expanding. So it is encouraging. I am pleased, but not satisfied.
I love that, and I want to build on it. So, Rohini, when you think about, and I say this often, we have to bring forward what's beautiful from our past and be courageous enough to jettison what no longer serves. Mm-hmm. When you think about that as we build, in the context of neighbor, in the context of community, in the context of a new economy, what do we bring forward and what do we jettison?
Yeah, I think, I don't want to sound naive as I say this, but I think the pandemic showed us all, yes, we keep saying that it showed us how interconnected we are, but it also reminds us very powerfully that, we have leaned away from nature and that we need to fold back into nature as human beings, to see ourselves more of a continuum than as a separate thing from nature, right? And people have said this often. I believe that this is going to eventually drive the moral imagination for the new economy. This much deeper sense of connectedness with each other as humans, but also the fate of humanity in this continuum of nature. And if we don't nurture nature or allow nature to nurture us, the future doesn't look too good. And it's no use being the he who dies with the most toys wins. Is not going to is going to be very cold comfort. So I believe that this pandemic, in some sense, has been, or this virus has been, some kind of tutor for us to reconnect the vision of our economy with the complexity of how nature works. And some of you may have seen Susan Simard's TED Talk and read her book on finding the mother tree. She popularized this whole, the science around the fungal networks under trees that actually work as communicators between trees, and helped us all to understand that trees are as sentient as we are. And I think the main lesson that came out of her understanding of this communication between trees, both of kin species and even other trees, that they are not only communicating with each other, they are doing actual trade of sugars and other substances that they need, nutrients, across each other through the mycelium network underground. And it destroyed the simplistic notion that competition drives everything in nature. Actually, it turns out it doesn't. Collaboration and cooperation is what drives the health of the whole system. And I think learning from that is going to rekindle our imagination for the new economy, Jacqueline, that you keep talking about. So I'll just leave this thought here for someone else to expand upon.
I love it. And it's strange how life works. Literally, 2 people sent me links to her book yesterday. And so, Rohini, there's something out there also that we are talking about trees. We are talking about nature. I'd love to actually bring in Mahesh in terms of responding to Rohini. Mahesh is the country leader for Acumen in India, and after really weathering the storm in lockdown in his flat with his family for many, many, many months, he did go to Missouri, which is this beautiful part of the north of India. And you talked to me about reconnecting to nature. So I just want you to start, if you would, Mahesh, responding directly to Rohini. Is it too naive? Is it too idealistic? Is this part of the moral framework that we need to think about? And what are you seeing in terms of the on-ground realities that you're dealing with? Is that just long-term dream, or is there short-term opportunity?
Thanks a lot, Jacqueline. Thanks. Hi, Rohini. Lovely to meet you over this. I think that's quite deep and multi-layered. So let me try and unpack it one by one. I think after 15 months, I went out to a place which is near Missouri, in a place called Landover, where in a nature reserve and places around that. And what struck me there, people slowly getting back to their jobs, people getting back to trade, was this whole point of interconnectedness. And Rohini, it's amazing to talk about trees and the nature reserve where we had the opportunity to walk and trek. And what the people were telling there is that who are the first people who give the signal about which are the species which give the signal first, and it's actually the birds. How did the nature reserve get built there? Was the birds started coming back, and it was all conscious efforts of some of private individuals to create these reserves and create what they are calling as alternative development, which is not to build resorts and hotels in that place, but actually build reserve, build the ecosystem with more trees, and for creating tourism, which is with the nature reserve. And how private capital is going into things like that was fascinating to see. That was a sign of hope, if I could call it like that, in this period. On the other hand, I had the opportunity to travel into villages and meet people, and could continue to see the despair of the plight of the farmers in India, and the very nature of how the work got disturbed last year and continues to be after 15 months for many people in terms of being very vulnerable. And both of them coinciding and staying at the same place. And that's kind of where I am, if I could say like that. On the one hand, there is hope. There are people stepping in to do things which they have never done before. One would never think of people building a nature reserve as with a private capital that way in India as it is being done. On the other hand, continue to see millions of people very vulnerable still from the aftershocks of what we have seen in the pandemic. And the one thing which particularly strikes me after that is for people like me and people like us who have worked and we started having a lockdown while I felt trapped. I think I would call it as nothing compared to what many others went through. And the irony of the concept of work, which already has started to happen in the world because of the way the productivity is happening, how things are getting produced, the state of people who are actually called as workers. I think that's really going to be a big shift which is needed, because this is a pandemic which has shown that many people who don't go to work, if I could use a word in the literal sense of the word, who don't go to work, have made the most of money in this period, which are people working in the capital markets who didn't have to step anywhere. They just had to look at the screens and they have made phenomenal money in this period. And those people who have to go to work in physical sense of the word, in many ways are the people who have suffered the most. And if we don't reimagine that world for the people who have been going to work and who are still needed, I think some of the nice things Rohini is talking about, which are all definitely through our cooperation, I think we have a big responsibility to ensure the other half is not left.
So, Jacqueline, could we talk a little about that? I mean, people say build back better. Right now, there are millions of people, right, who would like to participate, who would like to get the agency to build back their own lives. What can we do to help? You've been at the forefront of imagining this. Is it okay to jump in and ask you to say a couple of things on that? How do we help people to restock their lives? Those who have been shattered in the last 23 months.
Well, I'm going to actually, yes. I mean, obviously, Rohini, you know this is what I live for, is that we have no choice but to build systems and redesign our systems. So at the macro level, to what Mahesh is talking about, our systems have been designed to essentially define success based on how the wealthy are treated. And profit is at the center of all of them. We all have to start reimagining how we would redesign them by focusing first on including low-income people and the earth first, and then building for long-term sustainability, profitability, and it's possible. I think we need more role models so that whether you're sitting in a corporation or whether you're starting something new or whether you are running a community, we can see people who now have a different form of success because they have built those kinds of entities that are really including people and taking care of people. I see that Suhani Mohan is here. And Suhani, Rohini, you may know her. The woman could do anything on the planet. An engineer who graduated number 1 at IIT, one of the biggest Indian technology universities, but decided that she wanted to do something about the state of women's menstruation, particularly in some of the Naxal areas, the hardest to reach, often violent, totally cut off areas that have been decimated by climate crisis, and took a pretty radical approach to capitalism. And I wonder, Suhani, if I could just ask you to say a little bit about what you did and then how you pivoted in the crisis, and then to Rohini's challenge. What do we do now? And not only what do we who are have so much agency do, but have you seen even some of the women with whom you work who don't see themselves as having agencies, things that they have done?
Thank you, Jacqueline. It's really an honor to be with all of you inspiring women and Mahesh over here. So I'm really glad that you called me up. In terms of what we have been doing, we have been working in this field of menstrual hygiene and looking at it from a way in which we can challenge capitalism and look at how do we move from large-scale manufacturing to actually decentralizing manufacturing, giving it to local women and men to start production of their own, and create a community-based solution where community can solve their own health and hygiene problems. This is something that we had been doing for the last 5 years, but the pandemic hit, and we were really struggling because most of the supply chains were broken during the pandemic, and we didn't know what to do. And me and my co-founder, we were just discussing, and somebody needs to do something. And then we just decided that we have been in the hygiene industry for so long. We know how to build machines. Why don't we do something and actually solve the problem of PPEs in the country? So in March 2020, we decided that we can actually modify our sanitary napkin making machines to produce 3-ply surgical masks. And since we have multiple of these machines, we can quickly scale up the production of masks. But then the lockdown happened, and we were really struggling on how do we make these minor changes to actually start production.
So, honey, can I jump in? Because for people who don't know what happened in lockdown, one, you had created this distributed model where you let people build their own factories, mini factories that hired very, very low-income women. So you were truly hiring some of the poorest women in the country. When you say, when the lockdown happened, we had to move and we had these factories, just to give it a picture of with whom were you working and how were you thinking about bringing them into opportunity?
So most of our manufacturing unit, like you rightly said, were in tier 2, tier 3 towns and rural interiors of the country. And and employing people across different income segments, not just in production, but also in distribution of sanitary napkins. So we looked at a very door-to-door community-based distribution model as well. And all of that had taken a halt at that point. So I think one thing that we also did radically was reach out to other philanthropists. And usually, it takes us a while to think whether we should or we should not write a cold email to somebody. And I just want to encourage everyone to do so, because during the lockdown, we reached out to Mr. Anand Mahindra, who is the chairman of Mahindra & Mahindra Group, which is one of the largest automobile companies in the country. And we just asked them that if they could lend us their space for production of masks, because Mumbai was a really big hotspot during the early months of the pandemic. And within 100 hours of actually sending the first email, we started production of masks in their automobile factory. And we were able to make 1 million masks in a month's time, which were primarily donated to hospitals and frontline workers. So I think with that, we then expanded to actually engaging with our own women who were involved in distribution of pads. And there are such inspiring stories. I think, everyone actually just stood up for the occasion. And there's a woman that I would like to share her story, if time allows, called Rehana. She was based in interiors of Maharashtra, and she was distributing sanitary napkins and masks along with other jewelries and other imitation jewelry products. And during the lockdown itself, she earned about $500 worth of income. And that's the saving that she had, which she also plans to invest in her daughter's education going forward. So I think it's been so inspiring that despite all odds, her husband had lost a job. She stood up for the occasion and made sure that, she reaches out door to door and makes sure everyone gets sanitary napkins and masks, as well as she earns an income. So we have had incredible stories of courage in the last year.
So, honey, have you seen women that worked in these factories, and some had never been able or allowed by their families to work before? Have you seen acts of neighborliness or generosity that has changed your definition of neighbor to what Rohini was saying before earlier?
I think what has happened is a lot of times when we were initially engaging women to join their factories, sometimes in many parts of the country, there's still a huge patriarchal notion that women should not earn more than men. And especially when we were starting our manufacturing unit in Haryana and we were recruiting women, a lot of men came forward and said that we have also lost our jobs. We also require these opportunities. Why don't you recruit men first? And then, the whole discussion of actually making sure that, there's a balance in terms of employment in both men and women was something which was an interesting conversation. And people just opened up to the fact that everyone needs to stand up, and whoever can support at this point has to. So there was definitely a lot of pain and anger and losses of jobs, but at the same time there were more and more people who stood up to actually solve for the crisis and work together.
Wow. Rohini, I want to go back to you on this because you really started with the big frame, as you always do, and the moral imagination. And you said, I might sound naive, but again, having seen you, having known you, and also seeing you in some really ugly battles, both you and Nandan, your husband, because you've taken on the status quo at times, you know what the stakes are. You know how to create change. And something I'd like to ask you two things, really. When you look at the future, particularly given that philanthropists are under the microscope right now, and many people are really being negative about the role of the wealthy, and you articulate so beautifully that we're all needed. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about what the role of philanthropy will be, particularly since I just spoke to a board member of BlackRock, and he told me that in the last 18 months, global liquidity has increased by 30%. Mm-hmm. We've never seen a level of wealth like we have right now, and it is obviously very concentrated. What is the role of the rich? And what are some of the takeaways for everybody else? Where do we even think about going to be participating in this new economy?
Yeah, I'm very glad that the spotlight is on the wealthy. People like myself who've become, in my case, unwittingly part of the 1%. And I'm very happy that people are asking about the accountability of such wealth. Now, remember, it's societies and nations and economic policy and economic systems that allow so much concentration of wealth in the hands of the few. And those economic systems can be changed. So it is not a bad idea to go back to the drawing board, and there are many, many ways. And China is showing us some, but I'm not sure those are the ones we want. But still, to take stock of how maybe you don't want that kind of accumulation of the money is coming because all the value is accumulating at one end of the economic spectrum. And that just doesn't make sense to anybody anymore. It's not even really serving the billionaires and the super rich, if you ask me. If you just tap under the skin, if you tap under the epidermis of this. So I think for the wealthy, it is really the perfect time to look at the mirror and to see in the creation of the wealth what kind of distortions have set up. And it's so, never mind if you begin on the philanthropy side, though if you eventually you have to get on the side of how the money was made in the first place. But let's stick with philanthropy for now. I think
wait, even before you go, that was good. Even before you go to that.
Just let's stick with the philanthropy for now. Here is an opportunity for the tons of money sloshing around committed to philanthropy to really think differently, to distribute the ability to solve. Instead of sending solutions down the channel, thinking that we know best, how do we use philanthropic capital to restore agency, to allow people to innovate past these challenges that we are facing, to build resilience, to start with trust, and to actually help imagine systems that do not require this ridiculous level of billionaire-based giving or foundation-based giving. It's a real opportunity to restore balance. And I think a lot more of the people that I'm talking to are asking, how can we all collaborate to reimagine the role of wealth? Again, it won't happen overnight, but I think there has to be pressure from below as well.
Yeah, and I see that pressure coming. I think a moral question that we don't ask enough, but is...
I'll tell you a funny thing. Yesterday, I got an email from someone saying, you don't know me, but I've known about you since you got married when Nandan talked about you. And he said, good going, you don't need to reply to my email. It's good going that you have signed the giving pledge and you want to give 50% of your wealth. But honestly, you should be thinking of 99.8% to give away. So that is the new expectation, and I'm glad for it.
And would you respond, and how would you respond?
Well, he said there is no need to reply to me. So I'm kind of keeping quiet on that one.
Well, my husband and I discuss this all the time, and have slightly, as you can imagine, different views on it. But one of the things, Chris grew up in an evangelical household where tithing was a real part of the tradition. And one of the things that has impacted me from working in Muslim countries is the idea of zakat, that every year you give 2.5%, not of your income, but of your wealth. And if we started to build, maybe at the beginning voluntary, but in an interdependent world, that voluntary quickly goes to expectation, because we have other tools of applause and shame. That if everybody over a particular income level started thinking about giving away a percentage of their assets every year, again, over a particular income level, what would the world look like? How would we build it? And then to your point...
Yeah, but I'd be wary of that, Jacqueline. Because, don't assume that the rich are going to change the world, okay? They can play a small role.
I'm not talking about the rich. I'm talking about even people making, $50,000 a year. Starting to really think about all of us.
And it's so interesting. There are so many new movements like that. I meet so many young people who are not waiting to become old to start giving forward. You must have heard, there are 3 or 4 things I've been hearing about. One is that comes top of mind is Founders Pledge. So there's this group that says, if I do a startup, and if I sell my company or whatever and come into money, I will, and I promise now, I take that founder's pledge that I will put away right away a part of it to give forward. So there's a lot of that imagination coming in. We must nurture it.
Yeah, we have something in Acumen called A1F, where founders pledge 1% of their shares before they IPO to Acumen, and it's such a happy making kind of partnership in that way. And so super, super, super exciting to hear you say that. Mahesh, again, you kind of pivoted between possibility and complete despair. And so given the realities that you're seeing with, the 150 young entrepreneurs and other leaders that you work with, what would you say to them? What is their role?
I think, honestly, they have shown enough on their own in this period for me to tell them, especially people like Rohini who were on the call and several others. I think one of the things which I noticed was also phenomenally the ability to work with each other. I saw that a lot, which I think came to the fore, and phenomenal collaboration during the crisis time. And the ability to share resources, going just outside everything possible. And incidentally, none of them are any of the wealthy entrepreneurs yet, and they're very early in their days, but their willingness to share, our chat boxes were full with the amount of collaboration that they could show. I think, I'm sure from that, they would have learned a lot more about working together to create this impact which we are talking about. And I'm sure that they will know, and I genuinely, coming from a genuine sense of not false modesty, with a genuine ability that I have less to tell to them. I think I have more to see from them as Acumen now, and what's the next stage for us. And Rohini was asking just now, right, what could we do? And I think that's absolutely true in terms of one is percentage of giving. Another one which goes in my mind, more for us rather than the entrepreneurs, is how do you think about the role of capital in some of the enterprises and which are not exactly for profit. And during this period, we saw so many civil society organizations, others really stepping up. And in terms of the Samaj and Sarkar and markets were not. And how do you fund them? And it's often felt that if a consumer pays, they pay value more than the cost. So in these kind of organizations, they're working with community. They are doing much more than the cost of their operation and the service they provide. How could that be valued? And how could that be a way a philanthropist can think about giving? Could be a thought for someone like Rohini. I'm sure she has talked more about this.
Rohini?
Well, yeah, as I've been saying, I think it's time now for philanthropists to really step up to the plate and reimagine the trusteeship of their wealth. I think they have the ability to see, do you know, if you look at just the giving pledge, there is more than $500 billion that is pledged just by 200 people. And if you count all the others, just imagine the amount of money in the pipeline as philanthropy. We need to be able to distribute it rather quickly forward in order to allow people to get some breathing space to innovate around themselves. So that's what I meant by let us use philanthropic capital to distribute the ability to solve and restore agency of people, communities, moral leaders, because we are all in this together, as we all know. And this, if not now, when? If not after these 15 months of recognizing that the elite can no longer secede from bad air, bad germs, and all kinds of other things that are coming our way, including climate change, this is the time to reharmonize our imagination of what societies, nations, and the world looks like. We need
I love it.
So that's where I'll stop.
I love it. Well, and I want to throw it to Suhani and ask anyone if they have a final thought for people who are sitting here. Because what you said about distributing these ideas that the money is there, and now how do we distribute the ideas of where it needs to go is a powerful, big idea. And of course, we have to put it into execution. But I'm thinking about the many people sitting on this call who may not have wealth, who may not run their own organizations or companies, and are thinking, what can I do? And I'm wondering if we could just end with any piece of advice, any question that we should be asking ourselves, anything that we should be thinking about in terms of moral imagination, in terms of building the new economy. So, and we only have a couple minutes, so the fastest we can go. Kat, I'm going to ask you because I know you've got to get off, and then a minute each with Mahesh and Suhani.
Yeah, I would just build on one. I'm so inspired by the actions that the people up here have taken, including you, Jacqueline, and the words that are being used to share and inspire this idea of democratizing, distributing the ability to solve instead of pushing solutions down the channel. It's just stuck in my mind. I tweeted it. Is so powerful, reharmonizing ourselves. I think this, for me, as I think about the role of the corporate leader or the person who's influencing the corporation, one that may not be as clearly mission forward as some of the best of our time. I believe in change the world, start at home. Like this reminder of community. Home is our community, meaning our actual homes, our families, our friends, those we care about, understanding their lived experience and using that to inspire doing what we can, whether that's giving of our wealth and what we have, or to Rohini's point, how do we make that money in the first place? And is there a way to get better at doing less harm while doing more good? And then if you are in a company, truly asking those who are doing the work, What do they need? What is their experience? And the way Jacqueline shared that Acumen Fund pivoted as India went through its second wave of, can we break our own rules for the good of our community? And there are 3 questions that I like to ask to determine whether I should break a rule. Rules are there for a reason, but the 3 questions are, is it good for the employee? Is it good for the customer in the community? And is it good for the business? And if the answer is yes to all 3, with a broad definition of those, then I break my rule. And we have a new rule and a new reason to do what we're doing. So I'm so inspired and so grateful for you, Jacqueline. And to those who are listening, Jacqueline founded the Moral Leadership Club, and you can see that in her bio and at the bottom of mine with the clubs that we're a part of. Please do follow that for more of this great conversation. So thanks, Jacqueline, so much.
Thanks, Kat. Thanks for always being part of this, and you're really just a hero of mine. And talk to you soon. We are over time, so I just, so honey, quickly, Mahesh, Rohini, last word, and we'll close.
I think one way to also look at what you were saying in terms of how can people who are not leading organizations or are not philanthropists themselves is giving back in terms of time, giving time to your friends who may need all the support that they have been through, giving time to your employees, giving time to your friends, giving time to strangers to connect them with the right resources in these times. And that's something that I have seen thrive in the Acumen community as well, apart from different ways of pivoting with funds. So I just want everyone to think about it.
I love that. Thank you so, honey. Mahesh?
Yeah, I think for me, the main thing which I would like to share is that this is a period when all of us have also seen generosity and altruism inside each of us, as much as the desire to grow and what is by nature always being called as human beings are selfish. I think we all have realized what we are capable of. I think it's about nurturing our own selves, which we have seen in this period, and taking that to the next level. That's what comes across to me.
I love it. Rohini?
Yeah, last words. I would say moral reimagination means stay curious, very important. Stay connected, which will leave you to stay compassionate, and then you can stay committed. So curious, connected, compassionate, committed.
Perfection.
Thank you.
Perfection.
Jacqueline, last word from you.
Well, just quickly, and it goes back to the beginning, Rohini, in terms of what does it mean to be a neighbor, and how do we think about moving from this place of home, but also realizing that home is the world for us, all of us. And just the day before yesterday, we've been in and out because our apartment is under construction, and there are 2 women who were widowed in my very small building in New York City, and so clearly, like everybody I know, reached out to make sure that we could help take care of people in very, very small ways. Didn't really think anything of it, and I walked into the elevator yesterday, and there was this beautiful bouquet of flowers, and I thought, who's that for? Because so few people are left in the building, and had a little note to my husband and me, and it just said, "Dear Jacqueline and Chris, I love you, Joy." And it was this idea that my neighbor is my friend, my neighbor is my responsibility as I am hers, and how much richer the world is, even in a city like New York, where too often over the last 20 years, we didn't know our neighbors. And so I just so deeply appreciate this conversation and the privilege we all have to live in a deep way connected to the people near us. And also to realize, if you're on this call, you have that agency to be asking the kinds of questions that you all are asking. I often sum it up in, that mantra: if you're giving back to the world more than you take, and if we all did that, if every individual, if every corporation, if every nation tried to live that mantra, we would fundamentally change this world. So I just feel so lucky to know all of you. I learned from all of you, and I so appreciate the people that came to participate and listen and be part of this Moral Leadership Club. We'll be back in 2 weeks, same time, and I believe Krista Tippett, the extraordinary storyteller, will be joining me in another conversation, and look forward to seeing everyone then. And Rohini, I look forward to seeing you very, very soon.
Thank you and namaste.
Namaste. Love to all. Bye.